Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Medha Kale. I am visiting faculty at Tata Institute of Social Sciences. We are going to look at nature and women. This paper is part of environment and society. Many times we think, what is the relationship between women and nature? We see women in many roles. We see them collect food, fuel, fodder. We see them render for cattle. We see them in many roles. They are primary collectors of food in many areas. They are also involved in agriculture and farming. They have a major role in economies based on agriculture and cattle rearing, also fisheries. We've also seen that loss of common property resources and natural resources has detrimental effect on their lives. In comparison with men, women face more and women face adverse effects. So we see that the knowledge possessed by these peasant, poor, tribal women is valuable to the community, and it's passed from women to another set of women, either in family or in community. But on other hand, women living in cities or towns who are not interacting with nature on daily basis have lost this knowledge. Their ancestors, women in their families might have had that knowledge earlier, but now the lived reality is so that they do not relate with nature anymore. So, even being women, they are not close to nature. Their biology does not determine that they will feel close to nature. So, the lived experience of women or men is very important aspect of feminist environmentalism. To study these aspects of women's lives and their relationship with nature, gender studies and environmental studies have done many studies. One major theory that looks at the relationship between women and nature is ecofeminism. You must have heard about this theory. The theory is also popular in West but also in India. So what is ecofeminism? As the name suggests, it is about women's lives. It tells you about how women relate with nature. The major principle of ecofeminism is that women and nature are considered lower to men. In a hierarchy, they are considered lower to men. And because they are considered lower to men, their relationship with themselves and with nature is studied in ecofeminism. Ecofeminism calls for reconceptualizing relations between men and women and also their own relationship with nature, which are egalitarian and non-hierarchical. Ecofeminism looks at environment and women in a different manner than earlier studies. The theory was initiated in West by different thinkers. So let's see some of them. We will start with Sherry Ortner. She was the first one who propagated the thought that women relate with nature and their relationship is based in biology. She went to an extent of saying that the entire lives of women and nature are similar and the major source of their connection is in biology. The process of reproduction was the basic tenet behind this connection. So the biological commonality between women and nature was focused by Sherry Ortner. This position was criticized by many thinkers, mostly by social anthropologists, who believed that this kind of connection just to biology was faulty. An extreme position in this regard was taken by Ariel K. Saleh. She went to the extent saying that women's entire consciousness is rooted in biology. She saw the close connections between women's fertility cycles, pregnancy, reproduction, and feeding the infant as coterminous with nature. She connected women's lives very closely with nature and she found the similarities between natural processes and women's life processes, biological processes as similar. Carolyn Merchant took another stance. She believed that this nature culture dichotomy was false one because it was not universal. But she didn't say that women and nature are not biologically related. She agreed to that fact. She put down some very interesting things. She talks about pre-modern Europe and she talks about the imageries at that period. She says there were two major kind of imageries about women and nature. One was a benevolent, nurturing mother. So women were shown, or the earth was shown as a benevolent mother. And the second image was a wild, uncontrollable, destructive part of nature. It brings droughts, it brings famines, it brings volcanoes, and actually it brings death and destruction. This imagery gave sanction for human beings to control nature, which later on is translated in the development model where human beings are considered superior to nature. This is what has happened in West. If you review the ecofeminism movement in West, we see that basic common connections between women and nature and their dominations are shown in the theories. So if we see the highlights of ecofeminist discourse in West, we see that there were conceptual links between symbolic construction of women and nature and the ways of acting upon them. Underlying commonality between the premises and goals of women's movement and the environmental movement was also underlined by ecofeminism. It also put forth alternative vision of more egalitarian and non-hierarchical society. What happened in India? This is what happened in West. Women in West also got together. They challenged destructive programs and processes which were resulting in degradation of natural resources, and they also were able to get some mechanisms in place. What was happening in India? If we think of ecofeminism in India, the first name that comes to our mind is Vandana Shiva. Her arguments, her theories, and her practice in field of ecofeminism has been path-breaking. What was her argument? Let's see. Her argument was that domination of women and domination of nature were common, and they were rooted in the whole construct of modern development and modern economy and industrial development. She said that the death of feminine principle, which is the Prakruti, is behind marginalization, devaluation, and dispensability of women. She put the onus of the destruction of nature on industrial development and the model that the West has brought to the third world. She also linked material basis of discrimination and material basis of women's degradation into the picture. Her arguments were new, her arguments were different from the Western thinkers. Her arguments were not just ideological but were also linked to material reality. She talked about Prakriti being the principle behind the cosmos and it being the force that was important for regeneration and reproduction. She talked of Prakriti and she talked of Purusha. When she says that industrial development and its experience by the third world was important to study, she mentions that the industrial development model considered men, human beings, as superior to nature, and nature was considered as passive. The model allowed human beings to exploit nature for their own benefits. In this, there was violence against nature. At the same time, there was violence against women. So the commonality was studied by Vandana Shiva in great detail. She also looks at the experience of third world to the colonialism. Her whole theory is based on how colonialism and imperialism just completely changed the way in which people lived in third world. They also took away people's own theories, people's own cultural beliefs, and people's own cosmos, which resulted in natural resource degradation and also devaluation of women's lives. She has worked a lot in Chipko movement in Garhwal. Her experience with women leaders of Chipko movement, she says that the experience of third world women is unique. They have a special dependence on nature, but they have a special, very special knowledge of nature. She also feels that the material basis of women's relationship needs to be studied. Vandana Shiva's work has been critical. She has looked at development model. She has brought forth need to look at the processes behind development. She has also looked at how thinking about development affects nature, our thinking about nature, and our planning of nature. Vandana Shiva's work has been criticized by many people. One of the staunch critiques of her work has been Ms. Bina Agarwal, whose work in land and women and nature has been pathbreaking. Bina Agarwal has criticized Vandana Shiva's work on three basic principles. First, she says, her theory generalizes all third world women into one category, which is not so. She does not look at differences brought forth by gender, class, caste or race, and different ethnicities, races, and different social constructs. She also puts forth that there are other kinds of domination beyond gender, so you can't put all women into one category. Her second critique is that Shiva does not indicate which processes and when did they change the construct of gender and nature in India. Which were these institutions? Which were these processes? Unless we know those, we will not be able to change or bring forth change. She also says that India has such varied and diverse cultures that there are different ideologies and different stands of ideologies. So how do we know which position changed constructs of gender and nature? Her third and very important critique is this whole basis of Prakriti and the feminine principle is a Hindu religious notion. It's not followed by many other communities which are Muslims or Christians or different tribal communities. So the entire philosophical basis of Prakriti and Purusha cannot be applied to all people in the third world. On these three basic principles, Bina Agarwal has critiqued Vandana Shiva's work. Bina Agarwal also criticizes Vandana Shiva's stand that the development model adopted by West and its experience by the third world is behind the change of thinking and the degradation of natural resources. But Bina Agarwal points out that even before British came in or even before colonialism, there were existing structures of power, privilege and property who owned resources and who barred people from owning resources. So women were already barred in these structures. So these structures already existed. It was not that only colonialism brought these kind of oppressive structures. Bina Agarwal says that today what we have is a complex legacy of pre-colonial structures and colonial imperial structures which has affected into the management of natural resources. So Bina Agarwal's critique also takes a step further and says, for any change to take place, our analysis has to show where can we bring that change in, which structures need change. Vandana Shiva's analysis does not take us a step ahead, and we really do not know how do we change this structure or how do we change the situation. Bina Agarwal's critique of Vandana Shiva's work brings forth many important points in the field of women and environment. There is a component of women's lives and women's movement, and there is also a component of environmental movement or situation of environment in our nation. She puts forth a different kind of perspective. Bina Agarwal, through her studies of women and environment, has put forth an alternative framework which we saw, which was feminist environmentalism. She has looked at the link between women and environment as structured by given gender organization of production, reproduction and distribution. She cites the example of poor peasant and tribal women. They are typically responsible for fetching fuel, food, fodder and water. But they are not just that, they are also main cultivators. They have deep knowledge of their surrounding. They have deep knowledge of the farming. They have deep knowledge about the nature. They have the knowledge of medicinal plants. They grow backyard gardens. They grow vegetables. They grow many medicinal plants. So the nature surrounding them is well known to these women. Bina Agarwal's theory is called feminist environmentalism. The link between women and environment can be seen as structured by a given gender and class organization of production, reproduction and distribution. In simple words, this means who you are, how are you placed in the hierarchy of your society, of your community? Which gender are you from? Are you a man or a woman? Are you a tribal woman? Are you a peasant woman or are you a landless woman? The relationship that you share with nature depends on all these social constructs. So she sees those connections as structured in some organization of gender or class, and in Indian context, caste. Her structuring of feminist environmentalism is not only an ideological position. It's not for the sake of ideology. Ideology is part of it, but not the whole of it. So she looks at material basis, she looks at the actual lived experience of women, she looks at what it does as call for action, and then puts forth this idea of feminist environmentalism. So in this, she looks at the feminism and she also looks at environmentalism. Why did Beena Agarwal put this point of view forward? How is it different from ecofeminism? She says that women's and men's relationships with nature need to be understood as rooted in their material reality. It's not an ideological principle. It's not an ideological tenet. It has to be seen from their own material reality. She says, wherever there is gender and class construct, there is gender and class and caste division of labor, control over resources. These structures also structure the effect of environment on the people and their responses to it, which means that wherever there is gender division, wherever women and men have different gender roles, they have different controls, they have different rights, it is going to affect how they relate with nature and how they respond to what happens in nature. So feminist environmentalism takes into account people's lived realities, people's hierarchical realities, people's position in society, and their lived experience in terms of nature. Feminist environmentalism is not just an ideological position. It is a tool for action. It has to be used by organizations, collectives, and thinkers for a different kind of world. Beena Agarwal envisages that feminist environmentalism will allow us to look for spaces where we can struggle for better lives. The struggles are at two levels. They are for resources and they are for meaning. So what does this mean? So the struggle is with the groups who are dominating and controlling resources, who are at the position of power, property and privileges, and they control resources. But the struggle is also with groups who are giving meaning at educational institutes, religious and other institutions, media, which talk about relationships with nature and give meaning to these aspects. The struggles are with resources and struggles is also with meaning. So the call for action tells us that we can't just fight for rights over resources, we also have to look at thought processes and debates behind those. So the struggle is at the level of meaning also. When we see how women relate with nature, we also see the relationship between women and different kinds of natural resources. When we say natural resources, it includes land, forests, grasslands, water, fodder, food, and many different items that we get from nature and that are used for our livelihoods. Women share a very special relationship in rural, tribal, hilly, coastal, urban areas with these resources. They form a basis of their livelihood. They collect fuel wood, fodder, food and water for the household use and also for cattle. They are also primary collectors of wild fruit, tubers and many different kinds of non-timber forest produce. So women are linked and related to nature much more than men do. They are also related with nature through farming and fisheries. Their role in these two occupations is very important. If we see in India, 74% of female workforce is engaged in agriculture operations, but the nature of women's involvement in decision making is different. Their involvement in agriculture differs from region to region. In coastal areas, women's role in fisheries is very crucial. The most tedious work of cleaning fish, selling it in the market is handled by women. Even in agriculture, the tedious work of planting and tending the crops, weeding, winnowing is handled by women. In 1960s and 70s, the movement for green revolution revolutionized agriculture with improved seeds, farm technology, better irrigation and chemical fertilizers. It was very successful in meeting the primary objective of increasing crop yields and augmenting food supply. But if we look at women's lives, we will say that the benefits did not reach the lower socioeconomic strata, particularly the rural poor and farm women, in terms of greater food security or greater economic opportunity and well-being. The main aim was increasing the crop yield was successful, but the food insecurity that the poorer families faced is significant. Green revolution also increased cash incomes. It promoted cash crops such as sugarcane, cotton and other beans. It also promoted horticulture. It increased women's labor, but it also resulted in food insecurity. It increased female labor for farming tasks and they continued working higher. They took pressure of increased high labor burden at the farm, but the benefits never reached women. The control over money that came from these high yielding crops and cash crops was not in women's control. Green revolution also brought in mechanized farming, and in many places we see the new machines displaced women as laborers, and this had adverse impact on women's lives. Their relationship with farming as a resource was in danger. Whenever there were droughts of fishing, whenever there is degradation of resources, whenever there is a change in marine life, the worst affected community is of women. So their relationship with natural resources is a very important area that needs studies, that needs practical studies, on-field studies to get a deeper look at how women cope with these changes in their lives. So we saw different theories in terms of women's relationship with nature. We saw how thinkers from the West and Indian thinkers such as Vandana Shiva have looked at relationship between men and women and nature, and more specifically how women relate with nature and what is the common link. We saw how domination of women and domination of nature have occurred together, and therefore there is space for men and women to change it into a more egalitarian and non-hierarchical society. We've also seen how different models of development affect our own thinking about nature and our own organization about issues surrounding nature. We saw that how gender roles affect our relationship with nature, and as Bina Agarwal put it, we also saw that our social position in society, the caste, class, race, ethnicity and other things of domination and discrimination determine our position in terms of nature. It determines how we relate with nature, it determines how we are able to access nature and how any degradation or any change in natural resources is going to affect us. So we looked at how a person, and more specifically how a woman relates with nature. Bina Agarwal's theory of feminist environmentalism talked about this aspect. It talked about lived reality of women, and it showed us how different women from different communities and different geographical locations, different occupations relate with nature differently. It also showed us that the gender construct and the class construct or caste and race construct is important in determining relationship between women and nature. It also gave us call for action wherein we can struggle for resources and struggle for the meaning behind it. So these two important theories help us analyze our relationship with nature. They help us understand what happened and why it happened. It gives us a future direction in which we can look at more egalitarian, equality-based relationships between men and women, and also between human beings and non-human animate world. It also gives us direction in which we can construct a non-hierarchical society, a non-hierarchical position where human beings are not superior to nature or above nature, but together along with nature and doing and interacting with nature on an equal foot or equal ground. These two theories help us understand what is surrounding us. They help us understand the spaces in women's movement where we can intervene and incorporate issues of environment and natural resources. And also in environment movement, we can see spaces where women's issues can be brought forward, women's special position can be brought forward. So these two movements can work hand in hand for an egalitarian and non-hierarchical society. This entire gamut of women's relationship with nature is a very interesting area for further studies. In this module, we have tried to look at how ecofeminism and feminist environmentalism have studied this aspect of women's life, their relationship with nature. We've seen how ecofeminism looks at the hierarchy between nature and culture, hierarchy between men and women, and how domination of women and domination of nature has occurred together. We've also seen how Vandana Shiva has put it differently in Indian context. Along with ideology, the material basis of women's lives has been incorporated. We've also seen the critique of ecofeminism in terms of generalizations and in terms of ideological and material basis. We've seen how Bina Agarwal has put forth feminist environmentalism and how we can work at feminist movement and with environmental movement to bring in change. We've seen how gender and class divisions, caste and race divisions construct our relationship with nature, and in a call of action, how we have to struggle for resources and for meaning behind the resources. The aim is to create an egalitarian, non-hierarchical society. Both the constructs tell us how we can move forward, how we can work on the spaces available in the movements, and also how we can redefine our relationships within ourselves and also with nature. This will take us to a more equal, egalitarian position. This module tried to look at how women relate with natural resources and how changes at natural resources have effect on women's lives. For further information and for more information on these topics, you can look at the e-text and the Learn More section. I hope you have enjoyed this session and have learned about a very crucial fact of our life, our relationship with nature. Thank you.